after COVID. We also have a depository of better practices, EX awards, and collaborative projects. And lastly, we also run workshops and provide EX consulting for companies as well. All right, what other exciting things are coming up for EX Assembly? In October, we have our monthly webinar on another interesting topic, which is using knowledge management, the underrated foundation for using knowledge management for better employee experience. So we hope to see you there again. And we also have our meetup schedule, so please go on our website and join us from there at exassembly.com.au. Also, please subscribe to our EX Assembly newsletter. It's down on the chat box. Yeah. So some of the questions that we might touch base on are these four right here. And we can also actually use this as a point of discussion for our Q&A session later. Actually, I would really love to hear the panel's perspective on this first question. How is robust people or HR data critical to good employee experience designs? And what are the dangers of relying on unsatisfactory people data? So Rob, what are your thoughts on this?
I think data is critical. Absolutely, no question about it. What data you're looking at and why you're looking at it and how it applies to the organisation and what you can do with that in terms of anything that you would like to actually roll out within the organisation itself is an art form, but it's something that we don't use well within human resources in terms of my own personal experiences. And in talking to colleagues, a lot of people just say they use the stock standard HR data, and we'll talk about that later, I'm sure, but payroll, looking at where people live, who their next of kin are, what their emergency contacts are, and so on and so forth. We can all look at the stock standard employee data, and there's a lot more we can use.
What about you, Sandhya? What are your thoughts on this?
Stealing my thunder, Ali. No, I think that definitely have a reference to in some of my slides to why it's important to have a decent level of maturity with your HR data as well as with your workforce analytics. And when you're spending a lot of money and a lot of effort to design your employee experience, you want to make sure that you're making informed choices and your design is going to be valid for your workforce and not just following trends that's worldwide or global or works better in a different context. So it becomes, absolutely imperative that you start cleansing your data and making sure that any decisions you make are based on that.
Of course. And Robin?
Yeah, I would agree. And one of the things that I see commonly is that there's an over-reliance on employee-provided data, when really we know that only about 20% of employees are fully comfortable sharing what their employee experience needs are with the organization. So if we're not triangulating the right sources of data around what employees are actually doing, not just what are they telling us that they want, then we run the risk of basing our decisions or the types of employee experience that we create for employees based on the vocal and comfortable group that are sharing, but then there could be a lot of hidden needs that are not being addressed. Yeah,
great. Okay, we'll look forward to hear about that more in all of you guys' presentation later. So what is employee experience? As the basis of EX Assembly, our view on employee experience is that recognizing employees' own personal journey is critical, and workforce experience is actually a more accurate term. What I would really like to emphasize, though, is that the employee's personal journey is as important as improving organizational performance. There is more information on our website about this if you would like to know about it more in details. So now we'll just move on to our survey results. This is the results from the survey that you filled in when you registered for the webinar. So the first question: how would you rate the quality of HR or people data in your organization? A staggering number of 75% thinks that the quality is average or below, and that is true in a lot of organizations. So again, I'd love to hear the panel's views on this. So maybe, Robin, can you share your views?
Yeah, that's pretty consistent with what we see. And one of the things that I often suggest is, don't let a lack of perfect data stop you from making progress. And so even kind of having a data rating system to understand what's the quality of information that we're basing our decisions on allows people to start using the information that they have while continuing to work on cleaning and improving the inputs and the kind of relationships that drive better data quality while still taking advantage of that which we do have available.
Yeah, right. Okay. Sandhya, what do you think of this statistic?
I've worked with, I think, several organizations, both as part of the organization and as a consultant, and I'm actually surprised, happily surprised to see that there are some people who do believe they have really good quality data. I think these days people take an effort to clean and bring in quality data only when you're going through a large HR transformation or changing your HRIS system. But I think I'm agreeing with what Robin said. Don't wait till all your data is perfect. And if you want to start cleansing your data and making your data better quality, start today. And 1 year down the line, you'll be happier that you're adding, you're recording that extra flag, or you've cleansed the job titles that you can now report on them. So just make incremental changes, and you'll be much happier for it 2 years down the line.
Right. And Rob, would you like to add on the 2 points there?
Yeah, look, really quickly, it doesn't surprise me, the result of the survey. The most important aspect, I think, when you're looking at data within an organization is, as HR people, we look across our organization, we look at the organizational structures, and we see all the various silos of the different types of roles, departments, and other things that exist within an organization. Well, every single one of those would have a lens that they view this through, which will be slightly different to the way we view it and slightly different to the way the next person uses it. So this comes back to data quality, data governance, like Robin was saying. When you come back and you actually can understand the lens that you're looking through, the quality will be varying depending on who you are within the organisation. And that's the most important way of us as HR practitioners in particular interacting with the rest of the organisation, is understanding the lens they put on it.
All right, sounds great. Let's move on to question number 2. Does data privacy and security concern impose limits on collection and retention of useful HR or people data for EX? Robin will actually touch on this in his presentation a little later, but this result shows more than half, around 57% is actually unsure. So there needs to be better awareness for this issue. Next slide, please. Is workforce or people analytics data being used effectively for improving EX? Around 45% shows that the data is not being used effectively, even though we think that they can be used for employee experience mapping and design. So yeah, Sandhya, what are your views on this?
Well, I think I'm not surprised. I think employee experience itself is in very nascent stages, right? Every few years, we start seeing that employee experience comes to the top of HR trends for the year. And then something like a global recession or a global pandemic hits, and then employee experience ends up going lower down your priority line. So I'm not really, surprised at all by seeing this. But as I will refer to again in my talk, it starts becoming important when technology is such a big part of your work life. It starts becoming important that you measure employee experience and you start building on it. So that's our future, and future is already here.
Yeah, you're right. The future is already here. So Rob, what do you think of this and what Sandhya just said?
Yeah, I hold very similar views on it. I think from the point of view in terms of an employee experience, some people might look at what we're going through right now and say, it's heaven, it's a joy. I don't have to do anything but have a shower and migrate to my office. And that's around about 4 steps, depending on your hallway and your house and the configuration. Some other people might be going stir crazy at this point in time. So when you look at it from a workforce people analytics perspective, there's so many people looking at it in terms of productivity. They're looking at it in terms of engagement. They're looking in terms of work-life balance. Again, and you'll hear me talk about this a lot today. It's about the lenses you apply to that and trying to find out what that lens is telling you each time you do it.
Right. We look forward to hearing about this more. And of course, Robin.
I would agree with Rob. I think even when people analytics is being used effectively, there are so many potential use cases and potential things that we want to do with driving employee experience to produce different outcomes, whether that's employee well-being or community engagement or meeting the needs of our customers. There are often things that we do because they're easy or they seem like the right thing to be doing. Like immediately responding to negative employee experiences to try to fix them as soon as possible. But often we're focused on the wrong things. So, turning around that one negative experience at the expense of not capitalizing on or sharing positive employee experience stories that other employees would then use as the kind of permission to take advantage of some of the benefits or the offerings of the organization. Sometimes effective use of data actually limits the ability to overall improve the employee experience for everyone.
Of course. All right. And lastly, our last question from the survey is, how can workforce or people data be most useful for EX? As you can see, 37% thinks that it can be used to prioritize where EX effort is directed to, 30% to know your employees or workforce audience better, 22% to know the needs and aspiration of the workforce. And lastly, this 11% is actually a missed opportunity because EX can actually be a chance for workforce to participate in the design process. So yeah, that's enough for me. I'll hand it over to our first speaker today, Rob Wilkins. So yeah, over to you, Rob.
Thanks very much for that. And look, I'm going to just start my little countdown clock here just to remind me that not to go too far. You may have actually heard this term of the Internet of Things, and I think the Internet of Things is a really, really important aspect of what we're actually dealing with here today. Sometimes we look at workforce analytics and we look at employee experience and we just think human beings. And the realities are that there's so many examples out there now of organizations in real time utilizing the tools and utilizing the things that surround them, if you like. In this slide, you see things like Fitbits, like fridges, like Apple Watches, and we see iBeacons there in terms of beacons that can actually track where you're going and what you're actually doing. And the advantage of things like this is that they supply real-time data to us. Great examples of the use of these things are like mining companies. Mining companies take the time to be able to attach things now to workers' helmets and attach passes for working within the mine, and can pick up as people are coming through the gates in the morning whether they're compliant in terms of their mandatory education and their safety education and other aspects of what they're actually doing. So workforce analytics and the way that we actually derive data points right across the spectrum, right across the spheres of what we're dealing with, we sometimes limit our views in terms of the traditional human resource systems that we use. And the reality is all our customer data, all our business systems data, everything that anybody uses within the organization becomes a data point that we can actually sit and use to actually start to understand the way that individuals are interacting with the systems we provide for them to be productive. So there's a lot of data points, I think, that are really, really important for people to take on board in terms of the use of real-time data. A great example of a good organisation that I've come across is Sydney Water. They've got data points that sit out on real time at the weirs, on different drains, on different areas. They're not perfect by their own stretch of the imagination, but when I actually got to sit with some of the knowledge managers there and have a look at some of the data points that they were using within their organisation, it was amazing just how much data they had on the way that water flows in the Sydney Basin. So that's a sort of small example of understanding that individuals are actually interacting with this and dealing with this type of data. And the more you can actually get in front of some of the things that you're servicing and collaborating with, the better it is. So we'll move on to the next slide, because this is actually really key to understanding it. And this model here, again, it's a 4-box model. Again, all models are wrong, but some are more useful than others. And the what, why, how, and who has been a way I've fashioned a lot of what I'm dealing with from an information management perspective. The what for employee experience and the way that we're feeding back to our human resources area, one of the things that we tend to look at is the data, the environments, the machines, the contexts, the tools that are being used, the collaboration tools that are being used, the conversations that are actually being had within the organization. Everybody has these types of systems, and I listed some examples there like the HRIS for HR staff, but you've got the staff directory, the use of searches within the staff directory, staff vending machines, what are the temperatures, how often are they used, are people using them explicitly and using them at a particular time of the day, and what are they consuming as part of that? Are they consuming fizzy drinks? Are they consuming a lot of water? Are they consuming a lot of snacks? Do we provide for healthy snacks? Do we align with what we've actually got in place in terms of our promise? Staff cafes and the use of the FPOS systems within there, the way that we actually order in stock and inventory, the way that we look after all those things. Learning management systems and learning resource systems and the way that people are learning are a key one in terms of being able to do that. Yammer, conversational elements, Slack, Jive, Trello, I'm sure everybody's heard of those types of systems. So they're really, really important in terms of the what. The why is the objectives. Why are you measuring? What is it that you're actually looking at? What's the purpose? What are the objectives for actually utilizing this data? Are you monitoring workforce analytics? Are you now analyzing them? Are you using them for prediction purposes? Are you using them to intervene? Would you be using them for tutoring, mentoring, assessment, and feedback as part of your performance agreements and your performance review process? Is there feedback and adaptation of personalization, recommendations, personal awareness, personal reflection data that you can actually send forth? There are so many, if you take the data that's coming out of those systems and you start to look at it in terms of what the objectives are for utilizing that, there are probably some of our stock standard HR practices that can be enhanced and therefore, ultimately at the end of the day, enhancing the employee experience. The how, what are the methods that we use to do this? I will be upfront and say data analysis without any form of statistical analysis is really, really, really difficult. So you need a great stats person, a good data scientist, or somebody who's a great data analyst but has got a good, strong background in terms of those statistics. I found myself having to do a lot of work on my statistical analysis in terms of doing that. But visualization of data, there's so many great tools. And so I've found that interacting with the executives, sometimes it's much easier to actually visualize data than it is to actually give them a spreadsheet, because there are a lot of people who just need to see the picture in order to make the decisions that they need to be able to do. But data mining, intranet and web mining, social network analysis, who talks to who within your organization? What do they actually interact with each other for? Discourse analysis. What are the conversations that are being had on something, say, like Yammer? And, what words dominate those conversations? Is there a period of time that is actually being impacted? And that comes down to context analysis. Is there any historical context analysis that we can refer back to? Is there something that we can actually look at that we can actually draw a correlation to at this point in time? Is there something happening in the economy that we can go back to and have a look at? We're in the region of big data now, and if we're not storing that data, then we're not going to the depths that we need to be able to do that. Disposition analysis is probably one I'll focus on a little bit, but it's important. What is the disposition of the people that are coming to work for you? How do they feel about things? Do they have learning preferences? Do they have work-life preferences? Is there a way we can actually capture their preferences? And as Robin says, without actually being too invasive, but having them have confidence in the fact that all of this is leading to an enhanced employee experience. And of course, what their personal preference analytics are. What are the types of things that they have that are personal preferences as to the way that they like to make decisions, deal with situations, interact with people? There are things that we can get from people if we have the trust in our organisation and the things that we would like to actually see. They can influence the way we put systems, information, processes, policies and procedures and others out there. And finally, the who, the stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders within the organisation? Employees, learners, HR business partners, employee managers, general managers, leadership, the whole organisation. But you can actually take that, you can divide it into roles, you can actually divide it into responsibilities, you can divide it into job descriptions. You can look at it in any way you want to, and this comes back to my piece on the lens. So we'll go on to the next slide because this sort of shows my experience of what we don't know. We don't know what we don't know, and this is what I've actually found. It looks like a spaghetti map, and it really is a spaghetti map. But the thing that I've found greatest of benefit at this point in time, particularly in the human resources field, and to linking it back to employee experience, is that disposition analysis. Knowing more about the people that are coming to work for us. Some of this comes from their CV. Some of this comes from the way that they've interacted with individuals. Some of this comes from the conversations that they've had with leadership and the why they were recruited into the organisation. But a lot of it comes from actually knowing what they need. Now, an organisation I've worked for, from a consultancy perspective in between my roles, implemented a lot of these disposition analytics. And what they found out is that 44% of their organisation preferred to learn online. Something like 40% liked a blended framework, and a very small amount needed face-to-face education. To me, that was an incredible thing in terms of their learning preferences, in terms of being able to do that. When they put that into place and started offering more, and people were feeling a little bit disparate and cut off from everybody else, the requests for face-to-face education started to actually line up. So it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but trying to actually find out the things that are important to the way that people work within your organisation, things like personal preferences, are really important. Discourse analysis and social network analysis, I would absolutely advocate as something that gives you an insight into the way people interact and the conversations that are had within the organisation. And this can be critical to the way that you actually want to be able to roll out any interventions that you actually want to look for. These are the types, or not even interventions, the way you want to actually support bringing people together and seeing the way that they can interact, either project-based, either new product releases, the way that they actually work within the organisation and enjoy working with other people of like-minded attitudes. So if we move on to the final slide, what we don't know is a really, really important aspect of it. And today, there's a lot of people who like to say that, we need to call this something. But my call out for this is, don't call it learning or modelling or analytics, knowledge management, or even information management, because it's now just part of the way that we work. I think data analytics or information analysis skills are part of what we as knowledge workers in most organisations need as part of our day-to-day job. And the accelerating of change in business forces everyone in the organisation to make a choice. So we need to observe, learn and use knowledge from analysis while we work, or we become obsolete in terms of those. So 4 dot points I've got there. Our environment's screaming out for a never-ending cycle of analysis for impact. So what we need to do with analytics, we need it to provide a few things. Learning what we need to know from the analysis when we need to know it. Reinforcing the analysis by applying responses to insights and using those lenses that I've talked about. Immediately there is a need because of those. Knowing where to find relevant real-time analysis in lieu of lag data and indicators. The Internet of Things, knowing things that can actually feed you real-time analysis. Really, really important. And then finally, learning from your network of peers and comparing action and impact to refine the approaches. And a lot of that comes from the analytics that they've already researched and looked into. So you can feed off the rest of the organisation. There we go. 14 seconds to go too. Sandy, there you go.
Good job, Rob. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. It's really, really very important, that cycle of never-ending analysis that you talked about. Now I'll just hand it over to our second panelist, Sandhya.
Thanks, Ali. So I think I want to, continue that thread of thought that Rob took us through about, how workforce analytics and dealing with all this information is really becoming part of our life today. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, I think earlier at the start, our context of work has been rapidly changing. Like the past few years and even just the last few months. And what that means is when technology really runs your life the way it's running our life today, it means that there's a lot of information at the back of it. And like Rob said, workforce analytics, it's not just based on the personal information or employment information of your workers anymore. It's also about the outcomes they produce and how they are working together with each other or by themselves to arrive at these outcomes. So taking into account all these, the real question becomes, are we doing enough to really, interrogate the data that we have to make meaningful decisions and, create impacts in our organization? So as an example, in the organization I currently work at, which is, RAC, I think around last year, there was a hypothesis that, we could possibly start working together if you have a collaboration tool like, Microsoft Teams. And this is pre-COVID, luckily. And to think about it, we've had email for about 20 years. We've had some collaboration tools like SharePoint for a while now. We've had IM, right? So what are we really going to do to make people adopt a new tool like Microsoft Teams or any other new collaboration tools out there like Slack? So you can do that in two different ways. One is you can somehow engineer a global pandemic that would make you use Microsoft Teams, or as some companies are doing, you can look into something called gamification. Now, next slide, please. So gamification has been around for several years, right? As a concept, it's not new, but the term is probably new to a few of us. What does gamification mean? It's essentially bringing in game elements to a non-game setting. And this could be anything like, scoring points, some element of competition, probably it's time bound and there's prizes at the end, maybe there's monetary prizes. So all these are what game elements are. And when you introduce that into a non-game setting, you're bringing in a new layer of motivation for your employees or just ourselves as regular people. So a few examples of what gamification is in real life is your frequent flyer points, which have been around forever, and even cards like the Boost card, where your 11th drink is free. So essentially, what these things do is they motivate you to buy and purchase their product repeatedly, so that we can achieve a prize or some element of gain for us at the end of it. Another example of gamification is Gmail. Now, some of you on the call might not remember, but when Gmail was initially introduced, not everyone could sign up. You had to be invited by somebody, and everyone who had a Gmail account had, I think, 20 invites that you could then, hand out to your friends and family. And you very quickly found out who your close friends were. And that level of, creating demand, really made it like a game. And it became like a really cool thing to have a Gmail invite and to have a Gmail account. So, that's an example in the tech world itself. Fitbit, I think you're all familiar with. We've gamified health in several ways. I think a lot of organizations are having competitions where people, have bigger steps, so they're losing more calories, and they're seeing a lot of gains around it. The other one here is Duolingo. Now, I don't know if some of you are familiar with Duolingo. It's one of the most popular apps to learn a new language. It teaches you phrases in a new language, and it's just like a game. So you earn points, I think you get badges, and you go up levels. I actually have this app on my phone, and my son loves to play on it, which is pretty remarkable because he's only 4 and he still can't read. So whatever Duolingo is doing, they're creating a lot of motivation to just play with that app, right? So you can see slowly that we're starting to look into how we can potentially use this for employee experience, right? The next example I have here is Uber. Oh, sorry. So we've all, a lot of us have probably used Uber, and we kind of know how Uber motivates us to rate our drivers, right? By also having a rating for us. So if you rate the drivers, there's a higher chance that, they rate you, and you like to look at your ratings, and you can post to people that, you have a 5-star or 4.5 star. The other thing that Uber does on the back end is they motivate their drivers to pick up a ride before the completion of their current ride. It's a little bit like Netflix, starts loading that next episode bar before you're even out of your current episode. right? So there's a motivation element there which you don't even realize, and that can sometimes lead to burnout. But a lot of times it keeps your employees going. So I think we're starting to scratch the surface of how gamification can be used for bettering employee experience. Now, if you look at the next slide. Yeah. So I've just picked some pillars of employee experience here. And like I said, there's a lot of opportunities with gamification, and we're only now seeing a lot of large organizations beginning to tap into this. I think we saw, an example of learning with Duolingo there. Similarly, I think a lot of organizations are changing the face of their enterprise learning by, adopting levels, badges, and, things you can put on your profile to show off to your colleagues. My other favorite example here is with operations. Believe it or not, operational and your administrative administrative tasks can become quite a burden on your employee experience. As an ex-consultant, we had to file timesheets very often. We had to file travel expenses very often. And Google has gamified travel expenses. So what they do is, when you have a budget for, airline or hotels, and if you end up spending less than that budget, you can actually redirect that money to something else. So to a charity or to yourself or to a future, travel event. So this has not only created a less per travel spend, but it's also creating larger compliance, right? So that's an example of how you gamify operations. Collaboration is pretty interesting because, collaboration has been a key aspect of how we work and how we succeed at work today. But traditional performance management systems and processes have never been able to, clearly measure and reward collaboration, right? So companies like Cognizant, HSBC are experimenting with something like pods where, you have members of a team across geographies come together, work together, and kind of have friendly competitions against each other, which can be easily measured and rewarded. Now, I think an example for empowerment was, it was Uber. And you can see and pick, whether you want to see, pick up your next ride. And if you're somebody who works on projects or tasks, you have the freedom to pick what task you want to work on next. So you can change, how work choice is processed at your place of work. Now, innovation, brainstorming can be rewarded in several ways. A lot of companies are also using this. They reward each brainstorm idea with, some sort of gift or prize, and that encourages employees to come forward with ideas. Recognition. How many of us want to wait a whole year for our merit increase or for our bonus to take effect, right? And you might, slog a whole year to realize that, there's a global recession and you're not going to get your merit or bonus anymore, right? So those sort of bonuses have stopped motivating our employees now. So people are starting to look at new ways to recognize effort and how they're beginning to improve on their work and consistently improve on how they are creating outcomes. So these are some quick examples of how you can gamify several pillars across employee experience. Now, if you move to the next slide. Yeah. So what role does workforce analytics really play in gamification? Now, I would say that for most organizations, they don't just decide to go for gamification. It's not an off-the-cuff decision, right? There is a method to the madness, and there is a science behind it. So that decision tree that I put up there is an example of how you would come to a conclusion of whether you want to use gamification or not. Is it a behavior that you want to change? Is there a wrong behavior that's going on? People don't know how to use a system, or it's a new system and you want to make it attractive when there are other less desired options. So workforce analytics can really give you a good set of baseline data for all of this. If you're recording user preferences and your employee behavior, that can really provide a good foundation for making these decisions. Workforce analytics can also help you with your baseline metrics. And once you pick them and you gamify something, you're able to put in that feedback loop where you're actually monitoring these metrics and see whether you're moving the needle. Right? And once you achieve those objectives, you can figure out new metrics and create new goals and start creating new feedback loops. So I think in closing, I definitely, like to reiterate my point that it's essential to start building a robust workforce analytics practice. Start focusing on your data today. Your workforce analytics doesn't have to be anything fancy. You can create magic with, Excel sheet and a couple of talented people, and with HR business partners or an HR function who really believe in the magic that you can create with analytics. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandhya, for that. Very interesting how gamification can be used for employee experience design. And last but not least, I'll hand it over to our last speaker, Robin.
Great, thanks, Hallie. And we've had some interesting chat going on the side. I think it ties in well to what Sandhya was sharing there. That gamification can be a really powerful tool and especially helpful when it's motivating employees toward their goals and achieving things and progressing them through levels that correspond to what kind of outcomes they want and benefit the organization or our customers or our mission. But I want to share with you some thinking about what we should be doing to protect kind of our ethical use of data and do right by our employees and our organizations as a whole. So this is the do's and don'ts of employee data. And if we go to the next page, Rob already called out and Sandhya as well, some of the great applications and potential uses of employee data, keeping people safe by, doing that eye tracking when using heavy equipment to make sure that people are looking at the right things and not fatigued, making sure that people are not overworked and trying to do too much. We've seen a lot of organizations as we've all shifted to the home working environment, keeping closer tabs on when people are actually checking into the VPN and are they working at all hours of the day. And that's great if we're making sure that they're not facing burnout. But if we're using that for the wrong sorts of decisions, we could potentially be harming our own intentions and working against our best interests. And in fact, employees are pretty willing to share information with us when it helps to meet these objectives in ways that are useful for them. So if we go to the next page, I want to share with you kind of what we see as the most challenging areas to get employees to share data, but you'll notice that even in cases of things like their personal health status or how employees self-identify in terms of gender or sexual preference or ethnic identity, those sorts of things, while there is kind of double-digit numbers of employees who are unwilling to share that data, for the most part, employees are quite willing to share all kinds of information with us, given the idea that we will be using it to the right effects. In fact, you can see there at the bottom, only 4% of employees are unwilling to share any kind of personal data about themselves. But how we use that data is really the most important thing. With all the data that we're collecting, and Rob kind of gave a good idea of this today, all this passive data that's kind of collected whether we want to or not, it's no longer sufficient for us to stop and think about what kind of data are we going to collect. That horse has already left the barn, so to speak. So we really need to be purposeful and intentional about how we're going to use data. And on the next page, I want to show you kind of how different types of data are seen as acceptable or not. So if we think about things like activity monitoring, employees are perfectly happy with that, providing that we're using it to help make them safer. If you can go to the next animation, you'll see that there's this kind of line of what would be acceptable versus unacceptable use from employees' perspective. Making us safe, great. But if you're using that as a primary input, kind of how I'm using space or how I'm logging into my laptop in order to predict if I'm going to quit, or using that as a primary input to determining should I get a higher performance rating than one of my colleagues, that's not an okay use of that data. Similarly, if we look at personal life details, sure, I'm happy to share with you, what my self-report status is or what kind of groups I identify with, if it's to help connect me with other employees like me who might understand the challenges or opportunities in the work environment that we should be kind of talking about. But if you're using that to do things like determine, oh, well, Robin's got a young child at home, so we can't put him on this high priority project with one of our top clients because they, are too busy with looking after a young child and they won't be able to kind of take on the added responsibility. So making those decisions on behalf of employees is really a tipping point where it becomes untenable.
Robin,
and
hi,
then if we're looking,
Jeevan
yeah,
here.
sure,
Just
sure.
There's actually a question in the chat box. Is also the question I have. Is a question around, and this is a great slide because it kind of talks about the usage of data, which is acceptable to employees, but what is not. But it is the same data, though, right? So, how do you make that more transparent? Is it almost like to the extent when you kind of, go to an app and says it needs access to your data for this purpose? Yeah, but I haven't seen that in organizations. I don't know if you've come across organizations which make it that explicit.
Yeah, and what I recommend is actually kind of leveraging the existing protocols and corporate ethics and the values of the organizations to drive those decisions. So rather than bolting on something specific about how we use data, always filtering it through the same kind of decision framework that we would use in terms of how do we treat our customers, or how do we want to be seen by the community, and how do we protect ourselves legally. On the next page, you'll actually see a bit of a framework for, actually, let's go one more past this after the build. Keep going, and we can always come back to this. It's kind of making the same point. There you go, next one, where it says data ethics. Yep. So these are the kind of 4 pillars that we want to think about in terms of responsible use of employee information, and transparency is absolutely one of those components. So the way that we inform employees what personal data is processed and on which grounds and for what purposes is really critical in continuing to earn their trust and allow us to use the data that we're already collecting for a wider range of purposes. But in order to do that, we also have to be protecting the safety and security of employee data, just like all organizations have to protect their customer data. Otherwise, they're pulled up in the news, right? And it becomes a giant PR scandal, potentially a legal issue as well. And it's not just while it's being utilized, but data has a long tail, right? So we have to protect it as long as it's in existence. To that point of transparency, we also add accuracy so that people can see, is the data actually accurately reflecting my personal preferences, how I'm actually behaving, and do I have the opportunity to be able to correct the record if it's not right or is potentially unbiased, right? And then to ensure that we're actually mitigating some of the negative consequences, we need to ensure that we're purpose-driven. And that means that we're looking for the opportunities to advance value or opportunity for all parties involved in that decision-making process, the employees that are collecting data from and potentially making decisions about, as well as the organization's needs, our customers' needs, our constituents or community needs as well.
Robin,
and if we go to the next, yeah, there's a question there.
Yeah, no, it's I think Mr. Abhishek, he's reading my mind because he's got the same question I have. And Rob has also mentioned, how do you build the trust, or do you need to build trust, or are there regulations on there where, in terms of employee data protection, I assume Europe would be leading the way?
Yeah, so the problem with following the kind of regulatory requirements is that they're getting so diverse. And the kind of applications and technologies that are available are outpacing their ability to catch up, that it's not really the right mechanism to kind of check our own behavior against. And so, yeah, let's go to that next slide. And I think this reflects a bit of kind of how we think about the ways to develop that trust and willingness to engage and share. And it's actually by demonstrating that we're able to deliver something of value to employees who are sharing that information and trusting us to make the right decisions around it. Now, this is not exhaustive by any means, but these are the things that we see consistently kind of drive the most impact in terms of employees saying that they trust the decision making and are more and more willing to share information with their employer. It's when we use that information to do things like help align job responsibilities with the interests of employees. I mentioned before, if we're using information to say, oh, Robin has young children at home, he can't work on this project, that's not good. But if it was used to kind of target the benefits or opt-in kind of options that the employee experience affords, and it was something that pinged me to say, hey, did you know that we have kind of on-demand childcare available to you should anything come up? That's a great use of employee-specific data. So a few different things there that we need to be mindful of, and then the biggest one is not breaking that trust. We saw a situation with Barclays actually earlier in the year where they were utilizing employee monitoring information with initially good intent, but they rolled that out a little bit too broadly in terms of who had visibility into it, and then found that middle managers were using it to kind of more tightly control when people were working, given that we were all kind of working from home. And so they had to roll that back in terms of access and the level of information that people were able to utilize, because in some cases it's just too tempting to use that information, and there's not necessarily a good understanding of the potential power that it yields.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you very much.
Certainly. So I'll stop there in the interest of time. I think that's the last of the slides that I had prepared, but I think we've got some time left for Q&A.
Yes. Thank you, Robin, for your insight. I think that for aspects of data ethics that you talked about is very important and should be used to guide decision making. So yeah, we do have some time for Q&A. There is a question on the chat box. How can data build relationships? The key to trust is relationships. How can data build relationships? So yeah, Robin, could you expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, so I think relationships are well formed based on a number of things. The behavioral science around it would incorporate things like liking, having shared interests and things like that. I think the best way to do that through data, and I hate to harp on the same thing over and over, is thinking about mutual benefit and shared value that can be created through data and the decisions that are utilized to make better employee experience opportunities available to employees. And it's also a matter of that transparency. We often think that trust is kind of the precursor to vulnerability, but actually vulnerability needs to precede trust. So if the organization can be open and say that, look, this is what we don't know about you, this is something personal about me as a manager, if that's the level that we're operating on, that's the faster way to build trust as opposed to the other way around.
I've got a question, Ali. The question, which is kind of crux of this this particular online discussion, is that when you build or design experience, whether it's customer experience or employee experience, a lot of that is based on data. So, including how do you understand customers, their journey, empathy maps, etc. So it's all about data. The question I have is, we've kind of established that HR data is unreliable, incomplete, and to be honest, there are two buckets of data. So the one is the data supplied by the employee. So that's kind of the static data, name, title, where do you live, etc. And there is kind of the on-the-go or dynamic data, which is basically tracking data. So which sites have you been, etc. So the question I have is around the static data, right? The quality is so poor in a lot of cases. Is there any use of using that data to design any experience, for that matter? And secondly, with all the ethical concerns around, tracking, I'm just wondering whether there is a clean solution to this, or it's just a messy thing that we have to muddle through to the best of our ability. So probably, want to start with Rob. Rob, you've got a few views on this.
Yeah, it's a great question, Jeevan. Probably the best example I've seen of late, and it's across a number of organisations. And this is a little bit controversial, but bear with me on it. But organisations that have done away with annual performance reviews and actually moved to mapping and getting managers to deal with their employees on a month-by-month basis using things like sentiment indexes and the ways that they can actually map the way employees are receiving leadership messages, directions in terms of which way the organisation should go, having a look at a lot of those other things. So it comes back to that sort of concept of that static data versus the real-time data, because these apps that allow people to check in at the end of the day or check in at the end of the week and have specific questions that they respond to, and then maybe one thrown in by the CEO or one thrown in by their manager, in terms of mapping these sentiments, gives the individuals, particularly in teams, but at a wider level, maybe in a department or a directorate or wherever it might be, when you can when you grab all that data and bring it all together, you start to actually see these distilled views in terms of what the sentiments of individuals are. And when we talk about trust in particular, that's a really good way of being able to actually see if there are actions taken as a result of this real-time space and these sentiments that are happening. It gives people a real good indication of the fact that management are listening. They're feeling vulnerable because they're asking you what your opinion is. But more importantly, you're taking action on the basis that the sentiment might be up here on top of the curve, or it might be actually really down in the troughs in terms of doing that. So that's one example that I've started to see is really taking hold in companies, where companies are starting to really look at the ways that they review performance, the way they review engagement, the way people are actually buying into the organisation, the ideals, strategic directions. And some people use those sentiment indexes, like Sandy was saying, with gamification, and starting to actually look at that in terms of sentiment tables and the way teams are doing that. And all of a sudden managers go, gee, that sentiment has been up right across the board in this team for so long now. I wonder what they're doing that we're not doing. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, great. We have one question directed to Sandhya in the chat box. Being in the public sector organization in India, how feasible is workforce analytics going to help in increasing the output as the government organization follow protocols and rules regarding recognition and appreciation?
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting question. I have previously worked in India, though I have not worked in the public sector organization, but I recognize the context of protocols and rules around recognition and appreciation. And it becomes complex with how much you can tap into, what sets of data you can tap into to actually make some of these decisions. But I'm a big fan of just looking at static basic data that you have from what everybody would have from a workforce analytics perspective, or your basic HRIS data, and see what impacts you can what decisions you can make just based on that basic data. So I think if you're looking at like recognition and appreciation, there might be really formal channels of doing it, like once a year or twice a year. But within teams and within small pods or within a small department, informally, you can still have a lot of small appreciation events, or ways where you recognize younger and newer employees for making vast improvements in what they do. So I think there's one way to do things formally, to have it as a part of your organizational framework, but you can start building that culture from bottom up and have several informal or team-led appreciation and recognition events. And hey, even if at a small team event, my manager calls out my name and says, I think you did a really good job, I think the sense of recognition and happiness is quite the same as it being done formally.
Yeah, that's the Maslow hierarchy of needs, classic business theory. Yeah, so yeah, there's another question, and this is a free-for-all, so anyone from the panel, please jump in and answer. Does anyone have an example of where an unexpected insight from the data led to a documented improvement in employee experience?
I can take this. I was reading about this a few days back. I think McDonald's realized, I don't know in which country this was, but they recognized that having a person who is aged 60 or over as part of a team in a particular outlet improves employee engagement and customer satisfaction by almost 20%. And this data, again, it's based on pretty much static data, right? It's based on age of your employees. It's based on employee engagement data at a store. So it's not really looking at any of your more complex day-to-day dynamic data, but it's just the intent of looking for that data, right? Who thinks of linking up the age of your workforce to employee satisfaction or customer satisfaction? But it's time to start looking at those things to see, because you have to think of new creative ways to change your employee experience these days.
Yeah, and just to reinforce what Sandy is saying, one of the things that we're looking at is using every other piece of data within the organisation outside of what we traditionally look at as employee experience data, and using that as reference data. So we look at student outcomes, for instance, in the Department of Education, and the way that students are improving and the way that their learning progressions are improving. And we're trying to look at, are there any correlative values to how happy our teachers feel in terms of how they feel about the success that they've got, about the professional development that they've had during the year, and having a look at the way that they've been able to employ and apply that. And so, you start to realize that just about every single point of data in the organization can play a real good reference point, or a really informative space for every other thing that you're trying to actually align it to. You just have to apply those different lenses and look through them and say, what's its meaning, what's its purpose, what's its importance here, does it mean anything? And I think that's the big thing that I'd like to say is curiosity is a really, really good, resilient skill to have in this space.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. What a nice ending to this webinar. Thank you everyone for your questions. I'm really, really sorry that we don't have time to answer all of it, but please jump in our next month's webinar to ask your questions this month, maybe. Yeah, so that wraps up our webinar for today. I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you so much to the panel, Rob, Sandhya, and Robin, of course, and all of you who have attended. There is a feedback link on the chat box, so if you could fill that in, we would really appreciate it, how to make this better for you next month. So yeah, please keep in touch through our website. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and of course, our meetup page. I'm in Melbourne, so I hope I'll see you there. Once again, thank you all so much for being here, and yeah, feel free to disconnect now.
Thanks, Ali and Jeevan.
Thanks all.
Thank
you, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Take care. Keep safe.